Sustainable. Eco-conscious. Made from recycled materials. Companies are using phrases like these more and more frequently today. Sales of consumer packaged goods advertising sustainability in North America rose by over 30% in just 5 years, reaching an estimated $268.9 billion in 2022. And more than 60% of consumers say they'd pay more for a product with sustainable packaging. But underneath the flashy buzzwords, companies can fall short of their eco-friendly promises. Environmental activists say an ongoing legal battle with H&M might highlight a big company's alleged greenwashing. That's when companies mislead consumers with promises of being more eco-friendly than they actually are. In 2022, a class action lawsuit claimed that the clothing retailer's Conscious Choice collection advertised itself as sustainable, but it was actually not made from sustainable and environmentally friendly materials. The case is still ongoing, and H&M says it's taking these allegations very seriously, is looking into them thoroughly, and that its sustainability work has never been about greenwashing. Here's how a lack of transparency with consumers, long timelines, and weak environmental goals can all be signals of greenwashing. Greenwashing is when a company or organization uses misleading advertising to market itself as more environmentally friendly than it really is. Sustainable ESG funds, or investments that consider environmental, social, and corporate governance factors, have exploded over the past decade, exceeding $350 billion in net assets in 2021.
It's becoming increasingly profitable for companies to be seen as being beneficial to the environment. Consumers are increasingly demanding sustainable products. Investors want to invest in companies that have lower carbon footprints.
So why do people criticize greenwashing?
When you buy from a company that is engaging in greenwashing practices, you are encouraging that behavior to continue. Other companies will take note.
Some companies say their sustainability efforts are better than doing nothing. But critics would argue greenwashing involves weak goals, lack of transparency with consumers, and long timelines. Take one common corporate environmental promise: reducing carbon emissions. One way companies say they reduce their emissions is by purchasing carbon offsets. A carbon offset is an action or activity that balances the emission of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's a buyable, sellable, and tradable commodity. In theory, when a company buys a carbon offset, it finances an action that removes greenhouse gas emissions from the air, like planting trees or building renewable energy projects. This is supposed to balance the overall amount of carbon dioxide a company puts into the atmosphere.
Carbon offsets and carbon credits have become an incredibly controversial mechanism in the fight against climate change. And activists and environmentalists claim, and our reporting shows, many of these projects are generating credits, too many credits, and not really reducing or removing emissions that companies are paying for.
Critics say carbon offset goals are weak and that companies aren't transparent with consumers about how they'll achieve them. While companies can claim they're putting money towards carbon offsets, the offset's environmental impact isn't always clear to consumers. Plus, activists say companies have decades-long timelines to reach their goals. A company can promise to achieve zero emissions by 2050, but if it doesn't have intermediary goals, it's unclear when it will actually start reducing emissions. And time is essential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's because the United Nations Paris Agreement calls for global emissions to be reduced by 45% by 2030, in order to keep global temperatures from rising by no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. So who is policing greenwashing companies?
When a company does engage in greenwashing, the negative outcomes for them are quite limited. In the worst case, it might be a fine at this point.
In 2022, Goldman Sachs' asset management arm paid millions after violating SEC compliance rules with ESG fund marketing. Goldman neither admitted nor denied the SEC's allegations. But there's increased efforts by governments to start cracking down on greenwashing companies. In March, the European Union rolled out a series of proposals which would require companies to back up their products' environmental claims with scientific evidence. These claims would then need to be independently verified. This is part of a larger effort to make it easier for consumers to choose sustainable products. There are roughly 450 million people in the European Union. Regulations adopted there often lead to larger changes globally, since multinational companies prefer not to work with different sets of rules around the world. And there's movement in the US as well. The Federal Trade Commission is discussing rules that would regulate environmental marketing claims. It also wants to penalize companies for each time a product uses deceptive language. And the SEC is proposing new disclosure and naming requirements for ESG funds.